The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like wounded insects, casting the Seattle General Emergency Department in that particular shade of white that made time feel negotiable. Katie Morrison had worked these corridors for 6 years, and in 6 years, the hum never changed. Neither did the smell, that layered perfume of antiseptic, stale coffee from the break room, and something underneath that she'd learned to stop thinking about. Blood. Metal. Fear that couldn't quite be cleaned off the tile. She moved through the ward with the kind of invisibility that came from perfect competence. Not the visibility that made doctors glance up when you entered a room. Not the kind that made patients' families remember your face. She was the nurse who caught what others missed. The one who noticed a patient's O2 sat dropping at 87 before the monitor alarmed. The one who'd caught a resident about to hang the wrong unit of blood on a septic patient 3 weeks back, caught it quietly, fixed it without theatre or credit. Nobody remembered that. That was fine. Katie had learned long ago that memory was a luxury for people with time. Her hands were scarred, thin white lines across the knuckles, deeper marks along her left palm where the skin had healed a different texture, smoother in places, rough in others. She wore them like other people wore watches. Not hidden. Just never discussed. She moved through vital signs with those hands, drawing blood with a steadiness that made nervous patients relax, checking 4 lines with a precision that meant nothing ever infiltrated on her shift. Her colleagues called her the fore-whisperer behind her back. She'd heard once. Hadn't corrected them. The night shift had a different rhythm than days. Fewer administrators walking corridors. Fewer visitors asking questions. The attending physicians trusted the night nurses more because they had no choice. The night shift worked with a skeleton crew, and if something went wrong at 2:53 a.m., it was on you and the nurse beside you and whatever you could improvise. Katie preferred it. She preferred the quiet. She preferred the absence of scrutiny. She clocked in at 19:06 hours, checking the board for admissions. Standard Tuesday night. A diabetic in Bay 7 waiting for labs. An elderly man with chest pain in Bay 3 already ruled out for MI. A kid with a fever in the pediatric pod. Nothing that would require her hands to remember. Nothing that would require her to become something she'd spent 20 years trying not to be. The radio crackled at 20:11 hours. Incoming trauma. ETA 8 minutes. Male, approximately 30 years old, found unresponsive behind the waterfront warehouses on Seawater Street. Unknown trauma mechanism. No identification on scene. GCS of 6. For access established, fluid running wide open. Katie felt her shoulders settle. Incoming traumas were automatic. No time for the mind to wander. No time for anything but the sequence. She grabbed the jump bag from the wall and began laying out the supplies they'd need: 14-gauge angiocath needles, 2 units of O-negative already thawing, the intubation tray with a 7.5 endotracheal tube. Her movements were economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The ambulance doors burst open at 20:19 hours, and the patient came through on a stretcher like something the river had decided to give back. Young. Male. Soaked through. A paramedic was doing chest compressions while another managed the airway. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Ashford, Katie noted, was already moving, already barking orders with that particular confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Trauma Bay 2. Somebody get me a full neuro workup and, Katie, we need 2 more liters of ONEG running and a type and cross. Move. She was moving. She was always moving. What she wasn't doing was looking at the patient's face, because the patient didn't have one yet. He was just a body, just a problem, just a sequence of interventions. She found the second foresight, the AC line, and threaded the needle in with the kind of blind certainty that made it look easy. The hiss of air escaping as she flushed the line. The click of the bag hanging on the pole. But then something caught her eye. Around the patient's neck, partially hidden by the soaked fabric of his shirt, was a glint of metal. Dog tags. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of people wore them as jewelry now, civilian affectation, memorial thing. She wouldn't have paid attention except the paramedic's hand knocked the shirt aside and the tag swung free, and Katie caught the name. Malik Hassan. Her hand stopped moving. Not trembled. Stopped. Mid-motion, frozen in the act of adjusting and fore-drip. The name hung in the air like a question she'd spent 2 decades not asking. She knew that name. She forced her hands to move again. One more rotation of the fluid bag. One more check of the line. She didn't look at the face. She wouldn't let herself look at the face. But her eyes had already betrayed her because they were tracking downward, to the jacket the paramedics had cut away and tossed toward the corner of the trauma bay. A military-grade jacket. OD green. The kind that held things inside its lining if you knew where to look. And Katie knew where to look. She was supposed to be running labs. She was supposed to be focused on the task. Dr. Ashford was talking rapidly about airway management and she was making the appropriate responses. Copy that, doctor, and labs running now, but her attention was following the jacket like a compass finding north. She could see it from her position by the forestand. She could see the edge of something sewn into the interior lining, a patch of fabric that didn't match, fabric that had been meticulously stitched into the seam to hide what it was. A unit patch. A specific unit patch. The one from Tikrit. The one from the unit that didn't officially exist. The one from the operation that the Department of Defense had spent 20 years pretending never happened. The room went absolutely quiet. Not in the sense that sound stopped. Dr. Ashford was still talking, the machines were still beeping, the nurses around her were still working, but in the sense that Katie's entire world had contracted to the size of that jacket and that patch and the name on those dog tags. Malik Hassan. She had pulled him from rubble 20 years ago. He had been 7 years old. He had weighed maybe 60 pounds with his clothes soaked in blood. She had been Major Katie Morrison then, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to a task force that was officially never there, doing work that was officially never approved. They had come for high-value targets. They had found a building that wasn't supposed to be a school. They had found children. She had carried him 3 miles with a bullet in her shoulder. And then she had disappeared. The paperwork had been very clear. The operation had never happened. The unit had never existed. She had been honorably discharged on grounds of medical injury, the bullet had done enough damage that they could claim it, and her service record had been carefully redacted. Whole sections of her file simply gone. Names of colleagues erased. Unit designations removed. She'd been ordered to never speak of it, never confirm it, never surface in any official capacity. She'd been given a new social security number, a new address, a new life as Katie Morrison, registered nurse, invisible woman. They told her Malik Hassan was dead. That he'd died in a secondary collapse as they were evacuating. That there was no body, but he was certainly dead. He was not dead. He was here. Bleeding out in front of her. Soaked in rainwater and blood and 20 years of classified history. She became aware that Dr. Ashford was looking at her. Not at the patient. At her. His eyes had narrowed in that particular way that surgeons' eyes narrow when they're calculating something. When they're seeing something that doesn't add up. He was following her line of sight to the jacket, to the patch, to the dog tags. He was watching her hands, which had resumed their work but had lost their usual fluidity. "Katie," he said quietly, pulling her attention back to him with a kind of authority that made it impossible to resist. "I need you to step outside and grab the second crash cart from the hallway. We need redundancy if this goes bad." "Yes, doctor." She walked out of the trauma bay with the precision of someone whose life had depended on following orders without question. But as she passed the computer station where the patient's intake file was already being pulled up, she saw it. The screen. The file. The red banner across the top that read classified information, authorization required. Dr. Ashford was watching her in the mirror of the stainless steel counter. She could see his reflection. She could see him seeing her seeing the file. She grabbed the crash cart and walked back inside and did her job. But everything had changed. The shift change happened without warning. Katie arrived at 11:38 p.m. on a Thursday to find her name erased from the night rotation and reassigned to pediatrics, a ward she hadn't worked in 6 years, a place where she'd never requested to go. The charge nurse handed her the new schedule without meeting her eyes. "Dr. Ashford's orders," she said, and that was all. Katie didn't ask why. She'd been trained not to ask questions when orders came down. She simply nodded, pulled the pediatric unit assignment from the printer, and walked toward the elevator with the dog tags still pressed against her ribs beneath her scrubs, their metal edges cold against her skin like a secret with weight. The pediatric wing smelled different. Sweeter. Animated characters on the walls, lions and elephants and grinning suns that looked obscene in the fluorescent glare. Children's laughter echoed from rooms where fours ran into small arms. It was the opposite of trauma. The opposite of a man with no name and a face she'd seen 2 decades ago as a child covered in blood and dust. She worked the shift mechanically. 2 kids with pneumonia. 1 post-op appendectomy. 1 teenager with leukemia in remission getting her final blood draw. Katie's hands moved through the work like they were supposed to, checking monitors, adjusting medications, speaking in soft voices to frightened children. But her mind was 3 floors above, in the intensive care unit, with a man whose real name was Malik Hassan. At 2:13 a.m., during the lull when most of pediatrics slept, Katie took her break and climbed the stairs instead of using the elevator. Elevators had cameras. Stairs were older, darker, less watched. She moved like someone who understood how to move without being seen, a habit from a life that was supposed to be erased, a skill she'd promised never to use again. The ICU doors whispered open. The nurse's station was empty except for Jennifer, a registry nurse Katie didn't know, typing something into the computer. Katie didn't stop. She moved past the desk toward the patient rooms, counting the bed numbers. For 17, for 18. For 19, the room where Malik Hassan had been lying 3 hours ago should have been 420. It was empty. Fresh linens. No ventilator. No monitor. No patient. The space smelled like bleach and nothing else. Katie stood in the doorway and didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. Her heart rate didn't spike. She simply stood there and understood someone had moved him. Someone knew she'd found him. Someone was erasing him again. She turned and walked back down the stairs and returned to pediatrics and finished her shift and said nothing to anyone. But the next evening, something worse happened. The break room was where nurses went to collapse between shifts, to eat food that turned to ash in their mouths, to pretend for 30 minutes that they weren't holding human beings together with their hands and will alone. Katie had eaten lunch in that room for 6 years. She knew where the good coffee came from. She knew which vending machine didn't steal money. She knew which corner of the couch faced away from the door. She sat down in that corner at 1:38 a.m., Tuesday night, with a container of rice and vegetables that had gone grey. Around her, 5 other night shift nurses sat scattered across the mismatched furniture, Sarah from cardiology, Marcus from trauma, 2 nurses she recognized but whose names she didn't know, and James, the new resident physician who'd started the month before and already had the kind of confidence that came from never being wrong. When Katie sat down, Sarah picked up her phone mid-conversation and stood. "I'm going to check on my patient," she said, though her patient was stable and sleeping. Marcus gathered his jacket. The 2 unnamed nurses excused themselves without speaking. James watched his phone and didn't look up. Only James remained, and he was carefully reading something on his screen with the kind of deliberate intensity that meant he was reading nothing at all. Katie opened her container. The rice was cold. She lifted a fork. She ate. The room hummed with fluorescent light and the distant sound of a ventilator 3 floors below, keeping rhythm with someone else's lungs. James cleared his throat. "You know, there's a reason people are keeping distance," he said without looking at her. "There's talk about you accessing restricted files." "I didn't access anything," Katie said. Her voice came out level, steady, the voice of someone stating a fact about the weather. "That's not what the report says." Katie chewed her rice. One measured breath. The fork went down. She turned toward him and met his eyes for the first time. Then the report is wrong. He looked away first. She finished her container and left. Behind her, James sat alone in the break room and stared at nothing, and in that stare was the knowledge that he'd just tried to break something unbreakable. The next morning, when Katie came in to start her shift, the written notice was printed on the unit board in the hallway where everyone could see it. Her name. Unauthorized access to restricted patient information. A formal reprimand. Signature, Dr. Ashford. Date stamped 6:22 a.m., hours before she'd even arrived at the hospital. She read it once. Didn't touch it. Didn't argue it. She simply photographed it with her phone and walked to her locker and changed into her scrubs and went to work. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, at 2:51 p.m., Dr. Ashford found her in a patient room, a 6-year-old girl with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, small and bold and tethered to machines that beeped in steady rhythm. Ashford's shadow fell across the child's bed first. Then Ashford himself stepped into the room like he owned it. "Major Morrison," he said. He said it loud, the name like a challenge. A word. Katie felt the child's hand tighten in hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed back once, a signal. Then she stood and stepped into the hall. Ashford had brought an audience. The ranger's family, an elderly woman, a younger man who had to be his brother, a woman with tired eyes. They stood clustered at the entrance to the empty patient room where Malik Hassan had been, and Ashford positioned himself between Katie and the door like a barrier, like he was protecting them from her. "I need to understand something," Ashford said. His voice was controlled, surgical, the voice of a man who'd learned how to weaponize precision. "What exactly were you doing accessing that patient's file? What possible patient care reason could justify that kind of violation?" Katie's hands hung at her sides. One breath. Level. "I responded to a trauma alert. You accessed classified information. I was treating a patient. A patient you had some kind of prior relationship with. Some kind of connection. Some kind of unhealthy attachment that's now compromising your judgment and violating hospital policy." He paused, and she could see him choosing his next words like selecting a scalpel from a tray. "Tell me, when you pulled that file, when you read his name, did you remember him from somewhere? Is that what this is? Some kind of nostalgia? Some kind of desperate need to matter?" Ashford was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd never had to work to be taken seriously. His hair was silver at the temples. His tie cost more than Katie's car payment. He stood there in his white coat and his certainty and his absolute belief that he controlled everything in this building, that he could move people like chess pieces, that he could bury secrets and reassign nurses and move patients in the night without consequence. Katie looked at him. She thought of Malik at 7 years old. She thought of the bullet wound in her shoulder. She thought of 20 years of silence. She thought of the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one thing she'd kept, the one thing she wasn't supposed to have. One measured breath. One tear escaped, no more. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "I know what it means to keep promises, Doctor," she said, her voice so quiet the family had to lean forward to hear it. "Even the ones that cost everything." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, the ranger's family exchanged looks. The elderly woman's hand found the younger man's arm. Ashford's jaw tightened, and in that tightness Katie saw something flicker, a moment where he understood that something had just shifted, that he'd said the wrong thing, that she knew something he hadn't accounted for. "You're reassigned to the evening shift starting tomorrow," he said. "And effective immediately, you are to have no contact with that patient. No visits. No chart reviews. No communication. Are we clear?" "Yes, Doctor," Katie said. She walked away before he could say anything else, before he could see that she'd already made her decision, that his reassignments and his rules and his isolation protocols had told her something she needed to know, the man in that ICU room was worth burying. Worth erasing. Worth moving in the night and separating from every nurse who might protect him. He was worth fighting for. And Katie Morrison, who'd spent 20 years as nobody, who'd let herself be erased from every record, who'd promised never to be a soldier again, Katie Morrison was about to become exactly what she'd vowed she'd never be. A problem. The monitor flatlined at 2:48 a.m. Katie was in the supply closet restocking bandages when the alarm shrieked through the pediatric ward, and her hand stopped moving before her brain caught up. Not her floor. But she was moving anyway, pulling the cart, running toward the sound with muscle memory that predated her nursing license by 2 decades. The ranger's room. The man whose name she'd read on those dog tags 3 days earlier. The man she'd carried through Tikrit while his 7-year-old ribs pressed against her chest and his small fingers gripped the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only evidence that either of them had ever existed at all. Dr. Ashford was already there, hands fumbling with the crash cart, his mouth moving in orders that didn't land with weight. The attending stood frozen. 2 residents circled the bed like they were waiting for someone else to decide if this was real. Tension pneumothorax, Katie said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. The words came out in a voice that belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had spent 3 tours in a war zone learning to read the language of dying bodies before the machines confirmed it. Ashford's head snapped toward her. His eyes went narrow, calculating, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. Night shift has assignments, Morrison. Step back. Katie was already moving past him. The ranger's chest wall was tight, hyperinflated, collapsing the lung like a fist closing around what little air remained. His oxygen saturation had plummeted from 94% to 68%. His jugular veins were distended like cables. Every second he wasn't decompressed, his heart was being crushed by the pressure building in his thoracic cavity. She moved to her locker without asking permission. Ashford's voice followed her like a hand trying to grab her ankle, but she'd stopped hearing him the moment she recognized the diagnosis. The muscles in her shoulders had already shifted. Her posture had changed, no more the deferential night shift nurse, apologizing for existing in spaces. This was something else. Something older. Her fingers found the MRE pack she kept in her locker, the one she'd never explained to anyone. Nobody asked questions about the personal items nurses carried. She tore open the packaging, extracted the flameless ration heater, found the plastic wrapper inside with the 3-inch seal. 18 years of Seattle General. 18 years of sterilized equipment and sterile fields and following protocols written by people who'd never heard a rotor wash shake the walls around them. 18 years of being nobody. And it took exactly 4 seconds for all of that to evaporate. She cleaned the second intercostal space with an alcohol wipe, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in convoy trucks and field stations and once in a basement in Tikrit while shells fell outside. The attending was saying something, asking questions, but Katie's hands were already working through the anatomy. Midclavicular line. Above the rib. Below the nerve and artery that would bleed her patient out if she missed by half an inch. She positioned the improvised chest seal, a flat, airtight surface created from the plastic wrapper, sterile and small and exactly what she needed. Not regulation. Not approved. Not in any textbook Seattle General had ever purchased. But it would work because it had worked before, in places where regulation meant nothing and improvisation meant staying alive. The needle went in. Perpendicular to the skin, cutting through the intercostal muscles, breaching the parietal pleura. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of pressure releasing, of pressure that had been compressing his right ventricle suddenly breaking free. O2 sat dropping, the resident called out. "It will climb," Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. She wasn't asking for belief. She was stating fact. 72. 78. 85. 90. Stable at 92. The attending was staring at her hands like he'd just watched them do something impossible. Ashford had gone pale, the color draining from his face in a way that told Katie he understood exactly what had just happened. This wasn't a nurse responding to a code. This was something else. Someone else. The ranger's breathing steadied. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of a body no longer suffocating. His heart rate, which had been climbing toward 140, began to descend. 138, 128. 1:15, the room shifted from crisis into the careful aftermath of something that had almost been final. Katie stayed at the bedside, one hand on the ranger's shoulder, her fingers pressing lightly against the skin there. She could feel the pulse through the supraclavicular notch, the carotid artery carrying blood that would have stopped flowing in approximately 90 seconds if she'd been 30 seconds slower. Pain was information. Pain was data. And the body told stories if someone was trained to read the language. "Clean tray," she said to the resident nearest her. Not asked. Commanded. "Draw a chest X-ray. Blood work panel, type and cross. I need to know if there's more bleeding we're not seeing." The resident moved. So did the attending. Ashford remained still, watching her with an expression that shifted between rage and something that looked almost like fear. "How did you know the diagnosis before the monitor confirmed it?" Ashford asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, the way a surgeon's voice gets when they're standing in front of someone who has just fundamentally broken something that was supposed to stay broken. Katie didn't answer. She was still watching the ranger's oxygen saturation, still monitoring the rise and fall of his chest, still calculating whether there was additional damage waiting to kill this man in the next hour. The question wasn't asked by a doctor anymore. It was asked by someone very aware that something had shifted. The attending approached her slowly, like moving too quickly would break whatever fragile understanding had just formed in this room. "That was field-level decision-making," he said. "Not a question. An observation. That triage assessment, that's not taught in nursing programs." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to the revelation happening beneath them. The ranger's eyelids flickered. He was waking up, oxygen finally reaching his brain, the compression on his heart finally releasing. His hand moved, fingers trying to form words his sedation wouldn't let him speak. But his eyes found Katie's face, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that had nothing to do with introductions. She had carried him once. She would carry him again if necessary. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Ashford's expression when he left the room. He didn't look defeated. He looked like someone calculating how to fix a problem that had just become infinitely larger. And in that moment, Katie understood that the battle she'd won in the next 10 minutes wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the real nightmare. The first call came at 11:13 p.m. Dr. Ashford stood in the empty doctor's lounge, door closed, phone pressed to his ear while his fingers drummed against the granite countertop. He spoke in measured tones, the voice of a man whose authority had never been questioned. "Administrator Chen. We have a security breach in my department." "Yes. Tonight." Pause. A nurse accessed a classified file. Red flag on the system. He listened. "I'm handling it, but I need documentation that it came from above. Hospital policy. You understand." When he hung up, his smile was the kind worn by men who had spent 2 decades burying things. The second call came 3 minutes later. Same tone. Same careful language. Board member Richardson this time. "Due diligence on our night staff. One of them has gaps in her employment history. Unaccounted time. We need to verify her credentials before this becomes a liability." The third call was to personnel. "I need a transfer request filed immediately. Night shift RN, Major KA," he stopped himself. "Katie Morrison. Medical clinic in Bend. I want it processed by 0600 hours. Frame it as restructuring." He ended the call and checked his watch. 12 minutes. 3 calls. 3 safeguards. Everything sealed. By 5 a.m., the schedule appeared on the unit's shared system. Every nurse who had been working the code blue was reassigned. Chen took the day shift on orthopedics. Rodriguez rotated to recovery. Maxwell got sent to the ER observation unit across the hospital, a floor away, a different supervisor, a different coffee station, no crossover, no contact. The night staff fragmented like a crime scene being carefully cleaned. Ashford had spent 20 years in field surgery learning to close wounds. This was the same principle applied to a hospital system. Cut out the witness. Isolate the threat. Control the narrative. The following week's master schedule showed Katie's name disappearing entirely from the night shift rotation. Pediatrics only, 0700 to 1500 hours, days she wouldn't be near the Rangers floor, wouldn't be near the ICU, wouldn't run into anyone who might ask questions or remember her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone trained by the Department of Defense. Ashford signed the transfer paperwork himself. 3 pages. Clinic description, benefits package, start date, 14 days. Excellent opportunity for growth, the cover memo read. Bend is a beautiful community. Quiet. You deserve quiet. He approved it and sent it to the front office with a note, please expedite. Staff efficiency priority. The paperwork slid into a queue with 30 other documents, unremarkable, a routine administrative motion. He'd learned long ago that the most effective disappearances were the ones that looked like promotions. Katie arrived for her shift at 18:42 hours on a Tuesday evening. Rain hammered the parking lot in sheets, the kind that fell sideways in Portland, attacking the windshield wipers faster than they could answer. She'd slept 3 hours in her car. She'd thought about not coming back. She'd thought about a lot of things at 3 a.m. when the only radio station left playing was an all-night sports call-in and she was parked on the 5th level of the hospital garage trying to stop her hands from shaking. But she came. Because Malik Hassan was still upstairs. Because he didn't have family. Because someone had to know he mattered. Security met her at the entrance. 2 officers. 1 clipboard. 1 manila envelope sealed across the back with red tape that meant this had come from administration. The older officer, a man with deep lines around his eyes and the body language of someone who'd done this 100 times, cleared his throat. Katie Morrison. His voice was neutral. Professional. The kind of voice used by people delivering documents that end careers. She didn't answer. She already knew. This is a termination notice. Effective immediately. You're required to clear your locker and return all hospital property within 2 hours. You cannot access patient floors, the nurse's station, or secure areas after this point. He handed her the envelope. His fingers had already let go before she reached for it, like he didn't want the paper's heat to linger on his skin. She opened it there, under the fluorescent awning, rain drumming 6 feet away on the concrete. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead, signed by Dr. Ashford and countersigned by Administrator Chen. 1 paragraph. 2 charges. Violation of hospital protocol regarding unauthorized access to restricted patient information. Failure to disclose prior military service on employment documentation. The second charge was a lie. There was no employment documentation asking about prior service. The HIPAA forms asked about criminal history, drug use, infectious disease exposure. Not military background. She'd filled out every form correctly 6 years ago, and nothing in that hiring packet required military disclosure. Unless someone had changed the forms. Unless someone had inserted a retroactive requirement that had never existed. The rain drove harder. She stood motionless, the letter soaking through where the envelope seal had broken, the ink beginning to blur. 1 measured breath. The kind she'd learned to take when bullets were overhead, when blood was not yet blood, when her job was simply to keep moving forward. You understand? The officer asked. Not unkindly. I understand. She walked to her locker in the break room. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, muscle memory activated by muscle memory. Open the combination lock. 18:32:6. The lock snapped. Inside was everything a person accumulated in 6 years of night shifts. A spare uniform. A pair of compression socks. A photo of her unit from Tikrit, all 17 faces, taken 3 days before everything changed, before the operation was erased, before she was ordered to disappear and never surface. Before she became a name that didn't exist. She pulled down a cardboard box from the top shelf, an old Amazon delivery box she'd kept for something she'd never defined. Now she understood why she'd kept it. Some part of her had always known this day would come. The cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" went in first. A gift from Chen 2 years ago, before the reassignment, before the isolation. A dying succulent that Rodriguez had brought her from her garden because Katie had mentioned once that her apartment had no plants. The photo went in last. 17 faces. 17 people officially declared to have never existed. Her badge came off her scrubs. She stared at it for 2 seconds, 6 years compressed into a laminated card with her photograph taken during day shift, when the lighting was better, when she'd still believed that quiet work in a quiet hospital would be enough. She set it on the table, face up, next to the locker. Left it there. The rain was still falling when she reached the bus stop 3 blocks from Seattle General. 43 minutes of walking in weather that seemed designed to erase footprints. The bench was wet. Concrete that had absorbed 8 hours of Pacific rain. She sat anyway. The cardboard box settled on her lap, damp on one corner where the precipitation had found its way through. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry. That lesson never unlearned, even here, especially here, the irony that a nurse has to stay professional while her entire life collapses the way 4 bags collapse when the catheter punctures a vein instead of finding one. Her phone was dark in her pocket. 37 calls from her ex-husband, all this week, because their son had noticed something was wrong. Text messages from Rodriguez asking why she'd been transferred. A voicemail from the personnel department, probably the offer letter from Bend, confirming her new position, welcoming her to the next chapter. None of it mattered. The rain continued. A woman with an umbrella passed the bus stop, slowed, seemed about to offer shelter. Katie shook her head. No. The woman kept walking. She pulled the photo from the box and held it in both hands, rain speckling the plastic protective sleeve. 17 faces. Captain Reeves, who took a sniper round in Fallujah. Sergeant Chen, who stepped on an IED outside Ramadi. Petty Officer Walsh, who simply disappeared on a patrol and was never recovered. Others. All of them erased. All of them officially never existed. She'd kept this photo hidden for 20 years, the only evidence that they'd been real, that she'd been real, that the operation, whatever it had been, whatever it had cost, had actually happened. She almost threw it away. Her hand moved to the trash receptacle bolted to the bus stop shelter, the photo angled toward the opening, rain sliding off the sleeve, and for 6 seconds she stood there, holding the only piece of evidence that her entire first life had been real. One decision. Let it go. Disappear completely. Become entirely what she appeared to be, just a nurse, older now, tired, fired from a hospital job that never mattered because she was never supposed to matter. Something stopped her. A sound. Distant at first. The kind of sound that lives beneath your skin even when you haven't heard it in 2 decades. A rhythmic pulse, mechanical and determined. The whump 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 of helicopter rotors cutting through rain and distance, getting louder. She turned north. The sound was coming from north. Over the city. Multiple aircraft. At least 2. Maybe 3. The rotor wash was close enough now that the rain seemed to change direction, wind patterns shifting as something massive approached the airspace above Portland. Black Hawk helicopters don't fly over residential neighborhoods at 19:06 hours on random Tuesdays unless someone had made a phone call. Unless someone, somewhere, had answered the question that Malik Hassan had asked while waking up in ICU recovery. Where is she? The question that broke protocol. The question that started a machine moving that had been waiting for 20 years. Katie held the photograph against her chest. Rainwater ran down her face, and she didn't wipe it. She didn't move. She simply sat on the wet bench with a cardboard box and a memory and a sound that meant her life was about to change into something that couldn't be undone. The helicopters were almost directly overhead now. She could see them through the rain. 3 aircraft. Formation flying. Military precision. They banked toward Seattle General Hospital, and she understood that everything she'd built in 6 years of quiet night shifts had just become irrelevant. Because they'd found her. Or more accurately, he'd found her. The child she'd carried 3 miles through Tikrit. The ranger who'd been 7 years old when she'd sung to him under fire. The one name that had been erased along with hers. Malik Hassan had remembered. And he'd talked. She was still sitting there when her teenage son found her, breathless, carrying a wooden case. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, voice cracking with urgency. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. His jacket was soaked. He'd run all the way from school, from wherever he'd found them, the bedroom closet, the storage unit, the place she'd sworn she'd hidden forever. Katie looked at the case. She'd never shown him. Never explained. That was the whole point of disappearing. Make sure your kid grows up in a world where you don't exist, where classified black ops in Tikrit don't cast shadows over his homework, where a mother isn't just the woman who came home broken and ordered to forget she'd ever left. "Baby, no," she whispered. "Put those back." But he was already moving. Moving toward the hospital. Moving through the automatic doors with the kind of certainty that only comes from a kid who doesn't yet understand that some secrets are buried deep for a reason, that they stay buried because the alternative is blood on floors that should be sterile. Katie stood. She'd meant to stop him. Her legs disagreed. The lobby was quiet, 2:44 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour when only addicts and the dying move through hospital corridors. But Dr. Ashford was there. He'd summoned the board members for a different meeting, a closed-door discussion about protocol violations and staffing decisions. He'd been building his case against her for hours, each phone call to each ally another brick in a wall that would keep her buried forever. Her son walked straight into that meeting. Katie heard the doors open. Heard the scatter of voices. By the time she reached the boardroom, he'd already opened the case on the mahogany table in front of 7 executives, a hospital administrator, and Dr. Ashford, whose face had gone the color of old bleach. "My mother is Major Katie Morrison," her son said. His voice didn't break. His hands were steady. He'd rehearsed this, she realized. He'd researched, discovered, and planned this moment like an ambush. A night shift nurse, one of Katie's colleagues, the ones who'd abandoned her in the break room, picked up the first medal with trembling hands. The silver star caught the fluorescent light like liquid fire. She read the citation aloud, her voice hollow, for extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Tikrit, Iraq, in the evacuation and protection of non-combatant casualties under sustained hostile fire. Katie felt the room tilt. Felt the weight of 2 decades crashing down all at once, the order to disappear, the paperwork that erased her, the directive that she ceased to exist in any official capacity. Major Katie Morrison had never served. Major Katie Morrison had never saved a 7-year-old boy from rubble. That version of her was classified. That version of her was locked behind NDAs and federal penalties and the kind of silence that eats people from the inside. Then Malik Hassan spoke. He was in a wheelchair now, but when he opened his mouth, every authority in that room evaporated. He was no longer the unconscious trauma patient on Ashford's gurney. He was a ranger. He was 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse. He was the boy who'd been 7 in Tikrit and was now a man who'd kept his promise to remember. "She carried me 3 miles, Malik said. His voice was rifle crack steady. Bullet in her shoulder. I was bleeding through a field dressing. She was singing to me the whole way. Arabic lullaby I'd sung for my mother. She'd learned it. She held me like I mattered. A moment. Just one. Then the hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd worked there for 14 years, opened the declassified file that had been sitting on her desk since the Pentagon called at 1:13 a.m., since someone far above Ashford's pay grade had made a decision to let the truth exist in daylight. Distinguished Service Cross, Patricia Red. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. And a presidential commendation signed by the Secretary of Defense. Katie's son watched Ashford's face drain to white. Watched him understand, in that sequence of seconds, that he wasn't fighting a nurse anymore. He was fighting a decorated combat officer whose entire record had just been resurrected in front of witnesses. He was fighting someone the government had decided could finally be seen. The IT director stood next. Marcus Webb, 8 years in the Marine Corps before he'd taken the hospital job. He had 3 monitors on a rolling cart, and his fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd already watched the footage 17 times. Who'd already backed it up to 6 different locations. Who'd been waiting for this moment. The screen flickered to life. Security footage from the Ranger's room. Timestamp for 38 a.m. yesterday morning, the crash that had started all of this. The footage showed Ashford entering the room alone. Showed him approach the monitoring station. Showed his hand reach out, deliberate, measured, controlled, and disconnect the alarm wires from the defibrillator pads. Showed him reset the monitor setting so that a dangerous drop in oxygen saturation would register as baseline, not emergency. Attempted murder. Not even cloaked in incompetence. Deliberate. Clinical. Evil. The room went so quiet the fluorescent lights hummed like they were the only things alive. Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish thrown onto shore, gasping for air that wouldn't come. His fingers gripped the table edge. His eyes went to Katie, then to Malik, then to the board members whose faces had shifted from skepticism to stone. I was protecting, he started. His voice shattered mid-word. That file. That operation. It was classified. I was following protocol. You disconnected his monitor, Marcus said. Just stated it. No accusation. Just fact. Ashford's hand started to shake. His breathing accelerated. The man who'd spent 2 days orchestrating Katie's destruction, who'd made 3 strategic phone calls, altered schedules, filed transfer paperwork, built a narrative of her incompetence piece by calculated piece, began to crumble. Not in stages. Not with dignity. With the panic of someone whose every chess move had just been revealed as pointless. He stood. He tried to leave. Marcus moved to block the door. Someone called federal agents who were already in the parking lot, had been since the moment the Pentagon declassified the operation, since someone decided it was time to let Malik Hassan's life become his own. Ashford didn't make it to the elevator. He was still in the boardroom when the boots came, NCIS agents with badges that smelled like leather and authority. They read him his rights in the clinical tone of people who'd done this before. They handcuffed him as he wept. Not cried. Wept. His career evaporated. His freedom erased. His careful narrative demolished by a child carrying a wooden box. Katie touched her son's shoulder. Then walked past Ashford without looking at him. She found Malik in the hallway, the wheelchair parked under a window that looked out over Portland's dark streets. Major, Malik said. The word landed like a salute. She didn't flinch at the rank. Didn't look away. She reached for the dog tags around her neck, the ones Malik had given her in the moment before they'd wheeled him back to his room, before the world had caught up. She touched the cool metal. Let her fingers trace the unit patch he'd sewn inside, the one that wasn't classified anymore, that would never be erased again. 6 months later, Katie watched through Seattle General's main window. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table in the rain outside a grocery store in Bend. A folding table with insurance brochures that nobody took. A name tag that read Steve in letters that didn't fit. When someone called him doctor, his whole body flinched. His eyes went down. He didn't correct them anymore. Katie turned away. Walked back through the hospital doors. The pediatric wing had been converted to a veterans clinic. The board had approved her position before she'd even asked for it, the director of trauma medicine for the VA partnership. A promotion that had been offered and declined. She'd asked instead to keep her 12-hour shifts in the ER, the ones where she could see them come in broken and watch them leave whole. Malik was in room 3, waiting for his final clearance to return to duty. She checked his vitals without speaking, blood pressure, heart rate, O2 saturation all climbing toward normal. The hiss of air from the oxygen concentrator, the soft beep of the monitor, the scratch of pen on clipboard. The sounds of healing. "Ready?" Malik asked. Katie nodded. She didn't say that she'd spent 20 years not being ready for her own name. Didn't say that having it back, having him back, having the world see what she'd actually done instead of the erasure they'd forced, was still something she was learning to carry. Didn't say anything at all. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something that felt like permission. They didn't announce Katie Morrison's rehabilitation at town halls or press conferences. The Pentagon issued a brief statement. The hospital updated her credentials. And Katie went back to what she'd always done. She showed up. She saved lives. She asked for nothing. But now when a patient's family asked her name, she didn't give them the abbreviated version. Now when the trauma team froze and a patient coded, she didn't wait to be asked. She stepped in. And when the residents looked confused, Malik Hassan, back in uniform, walking on both legs, assigned as a liaison to the VA clinic, would simply say it. "That's Major Morrison. She's our medic." Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know the strength you carried? Have you ever watched the world try to erase you, only to realize that some truths can't stay buried forever? Subscribe. Like. Tell me in the comments, was Ashford's punishment enough? Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help.